Richard Harrington was born in a rundown neighborhood on the outskirts of Chicago. His parents, both factory workers, had dreamed of better things for their son, but they could offer little besides unwavering love. Determined to break free from the cycle of poverty, Richard threw himself into academics. He excelled at mathematics, cultivated a keen sense of observation, and, most importantly, learned how to connect with people on a deeper level. By the time he was 18, he had a full scholarship to the University of Pennsylvania. He went on to major in finance and never looked back. With the exuberance of youth on his side, Richard entered the world of venture capitalism right after graduation. He spent sleepless nights poring over business proposals, seeking that one diamond in the rough that could catapult him into a realm few ever reached. His first major success arrived when he invested in a small tech startup specializing in artificial intelligence for healthcare, a visionary idea that eventually sold for billions. Before he turned 30, Richard Harrington was already known as a wonder boy in Silicon Valley, with a net worth that soared past $100 million. But even as his fortune grew, so did the weight of his ambition. Money was never enough. Each new million seemed to birth another plan for expansion. His personal life, however, remained an afterthought until he met Serena Levine. Their meeting was strangely mundane, which both would later joke about. A mutual acquaintance invited them to a charity gala at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Richard had come to talk business, aiming to meet potential investors in his next project. Serena, on the other hand, was there because she believed in using her own modest trust fund to support the arts. She had studied art history at Columbia and was known for her philanthropic leanings. Serena stood out at the gala not because of a flashy outfit, but because of her calm grace and genuine smile. Richard, used to the hardened expressions of Wall Street, found her refreshing. By the end of the evening, they had exchanged numbers. A courtship began that was both swift and mesmerizing. Within a year, they married at a cliffside villa in Capri. The wedding, attended by a who's who of business tycoons and celebrities, was deemed the event of the season. Photographs of the lavish affair graced the pages of countless magazines, painting a portrait of a modern fairy tale, the young billionaire and his captivating bride. As the Harrington empire grew, so did the expectations on Richard's shoulders. He ventured into real estate, focusing on luxury properties in major cities across the globe. He launched a hedge fund that specialized in disruptive technologies. His net worth soared to over $7 billion. Meanwhile, Serena found her calling in philanthropy, championing causes that ranged from environmental preservation to educational initiatives in underprivileged communities. She became a beloved figure among society's elite and among those she served. Though they shared a glamorous life, their marriage was not without its challenges. Between the demands of his businesses and her philanthropic commitments, their time together became increasingly scarce. They found themselves working on parallel tracks, both passionate, both driven, yet somehow drifting apart in the process. There were days when Richard would come home past midnight, too tired to exchange more than a few words. Serena, busy hosting fundraising events and traveling to remote areas for charity work, would sometimes go for days without seeing him at all. Whenever they tried to reconnect, scheduling a weekend on their yacht or a short holiday in the Maldives, life intruded. An emergency business meeting or a last-minute philanthropic crisis always overshadowed their private moments. Still, they fought to keep the bond alive. They shared an unspoken promise to protect what they had built together. Their love was real, forged by mutual respect and admiration, even if the cracks in the foundation were beginning to show. While Richard Harrington basked in the glow of public success, he could sense the emptiness lurking behind it all. On late nights, when he gazed into the mirror, he sometimes wondered whether money truly equated to happiness. Serena, too, sensed a distance opening between them, but her approach was to believe in hope, certain that their connection would prevail over the demands of ambition. Richard's longtime friend and legal advisor, David Albrecht, was the one who first noticed the strain. David had witnessed Richard's rise from a scrappy go-getter to a revered magnate, and he worried about the toll it took on Richard's once ebullient spirit. Over drinks at a private lounge in Manhattan, David commented, "You look exhausted. You need to slow down." Richard merely shrugged. "I'll rest when I'm sure I've done enough." "Enough for whom?" David asked, his expression one of genuine concern. But Richard couldn't answer. He might have said, "For Serena," or "For my parents," or even "For myself." The truth was, he no longer knew. Ambition had become its own master, a relentless drive pushing him forward. Unaware of the storm that lay ahead, Richard assumed life's challenges would remain confined to boardrooms and financial deals. He failed to see that the most significant battles were sometimes fought within the human heart, and that wealth offered little defense against emotional ruin. In the Harrington penthouse, Serena was finishing the plans for her next major charity event. She hummed softly, imagining how proud Richard would be of the funds raised to build libraries in rural areas. She glanced at the clock, noting Richard's delayed return. She sent him a quick message. "Miss you. Come home soon." She had no idea that everything they had built would soon come crashing down, nor that their story, seemingly so perfect from the outside, would unravel in the most painful way possible. Life in the Harrington residence was a tapestry woven of lavish dinners, philanthropic luncheons, and midnight strategy sessions. The penthouse, perched atop one of Manhattan's most prestigious addresses, overlooked Central Park. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered sweeping views of the city's skyline, a testament to Richard's success. Yet beneath the gleam of imported marble floors and custom artwork, a quiet tension had begun to manifest. That tension was partly born of Richard's relentless schedule. On a typical day, he was up by 6, off to the gym for an hour, then in the office by 8. Investors, clients, and his management teams demanded every ounce of his focus. He attended back-to-back meetings that often stretched late into the night. Meanwhile, Serena poured her energy into her philanthropic work. She organized black-tie dinners and silent auctions, personally visited schools to ensure that funds were used properly, and collaborated with environmental groups to protect wetlands threatened by real estate developments, ironically, sometimes by Richard's own projects. Over the months, they seemed more like affectionate roommates than a married couple, each traveling along a separate trajectory. They rarely fought. Fights required confrontation, and confrontation required time together. When they did share meals, they kept their conversations polite, often drifting to topics of philanthropy or Richard's newest business venture. Friends and acquaintances admired them from a distance, calling them a power couple, but if they bothered to look deeper, they'd see how precariously balanced their marriage had become. One evening, Serena attended a gala to raise funds for medical research. Richard was slated to speak as a keynote sponsor, but sent a last-minute text apologizing for not being able to make it due to an emergency board meeting. Serena tried to quell her disappointment, but frustration brewed beneath her calm exterior. It was not his absence at one event that hurt her. It was the pattern, the ongoing sense that Richard had begun treating their marriage like a side project. By midnight, when she returned home, she discovered the penthouse dimly lit, with Richard passed out on the couch. Papers were strewn across the coffee table, bearing complicated financial data. Silently, she removed his shoes and draped a blanket over him. As she did, she took in the lines of fatigue etched on his face. Concern flooded her thoughts. She wanted to shake him awake and demand why he felt compelled to push himself this hard. But she also understood how deep his sense of responsibility ran. For a moment, she hated the money, the power, all the trappings that had turned her once light-hearted husband into this worn, driven figure. That night, she couldn't sleep. Instead, she hovered near the window, feeling the cool glass under her fingertips. The city glowed below like a jewel, a living thing. She wondered if there was still a path to the Richard she once knew, the one who was excited about the promise of the future, about family, about love. Confusion mingled with longing, and she whispered a silent prayer into the New York night. Let us find our way back to each other. At the Harrington Group's main office in Midtown, tensions were rising too. The company was undergoing rapid expansion, diving into new markets and acquiring properties worldwide. That meant Richard needed a robust support system, particularly an assistant who could handle the chaos of his everyday life. His old assistant had retired, citing health reasons. Several candidates had come and gone, none able to keep pace with Richard's demanding schedule. David Albrecht, who besides being a close friend was also a member of the board of directors, suggested hiring a professional headhunter to find the perfect candidate. "We need someone who can match your energy and your standards," David insisted. "Someone who can manage your calendar without losing track of what you need at any given moment." Richard agreed. He understood that in the sea of applicants there might be someone with that rare mix of organizational skill, social poise, and discretion. But after endless interviews, he was unimpressed. Some were too deferential, some lacked the requisite experience, and others were simply overwhelmed by the pace of Harrington Group's operations. As the pressure mounted, David arrived one morning with a fresh resume. "She's new to the city, but her references are impeccable," he said. "Olivia Morgan. She's managed corporate events at her previous firm, worked with philanthropic foundations, and even has legal knowledge. Want to meet her?" Tired of the search and intrigued by the variety in Olivia's skill set, Richard scheduled an interview for the next day. He barely glanced at her photograph in the dossier, just a quick look at a bright, confident smile framed by long, chestnut-brown hair. He assumed that if David recommended her, she must be qualified. Outside the realms of business, Serena had begun suspecting that their marriage was in dangerous territory. She sought advice from an old college friend, Angela Dupree, a psychologist specializing in relationship counseling. Over lunch, Serena confessed her growing fears. Angela listened carefully, stirring her coffee in silent thought. "Have you tried a couples retreat?" "Therapy?" Angela suggested gently. "I've floated the idea, but Richard always finds an excuse," Serena said. "He's so caught up in everything. I'm not even sure he's aware of how disconnected we've become." Angela placed a hand over hers. "You both have to acknowledge it, or it's going to fester until it's too late." Serena breathed in, knowing the truth of Angela's words. She resolved to talk to Richard as soon as possible, to sit him down and stress the urgency of saving what they had. Meanwhile, oblivious to her plan, Richard had set in motion the next chapter of their lives by agreeing to interview Olivia Morgan, a decision that would either help quell the chaos in his professional life or unleash a crisis that would tear everything apart. That night, Serena found Richard in his study. Late again, reviewing business proposals, she entered quietly, wearing the regal poise that never abandoned her. "We need to talk," she said, voice trembling just enough to reveal her unease. He peered at her from behind thick folders, brows furrowed. "Of course. Can it wait just a moment? I'm finalizing some numbers." She moved closer and gently placed her hand on top of the documents. "It can't. Not anymore." He noticed the strain in her eyes, the subtle shake of her hand, and for the first time in weeks he closed the folders and gave her his full attention. In that moment, before either spoke another word, both realized how far they had drifted. Yet neither could have guessed how a stranger named Olivia Morgan would soon alter the fabric of their existence. The following morning, Richard arrived at his office 15 minutes earlier than usual. His corner suite on the 52nd floor was a sleek testament to modern design glass walls, minimalist furniture, and a single abstract painting on the wall behind his desk. From here, he could see the bustle of Manhattan, a reminder of his achievements and the relentless pace that fueled them. He barely had time to settle into his chair when his secretary informed him that Olivia Morgan had arrived. "Shall I send her in?" the woman asked, trying to hide her exhaustion after dealing with back-to-back candidate interviews over the last few weeks. "Yes, please," Richard replied, setting aside a cup of strong black coffee. Olivia Morgan stepped into the office with an assured stride. She wore a crisp navy suit, her hair neatly pulled back into a low ponytail. Her eyes shone with a certain determined warmth, and she carried a slim folder containing her resume and reference letters. As she approached Richard's desk, she offered a confident yet respectful smile. "Mr. Harrington, thank you for seeing me," she said, her voice steady. Richard was initially struck by her composure. Most applicants betrayed some measure of nervousness, but Olivia displayed an ease that suggested she was no stranger to high-pressure environments. He gestured for her to sit and scanned her resume again, this time with more focus. "You've got quite the diverse background," he began, noting her stints as an event coordinator and a legal aid. "Why are you interested in becoming an executive assistant?" Olivia folded her hands on her lap. "I thrive in roles that require multitasking and problem-solving. In my previous position, I organized international conferences and negotiated sponsorship deals. It was a high-pressure environment, and I excelled. But I want a new challenge, somewhere I can grow, and a place where I can bring real value." Richard appreciated the directness of her tone. He asked follow-up questions about her experiences handling emergencies under tight deadlines, her familiarity with corporate policies, and her willingness to work beyond typical business hours. Each time, Olivia responded with clarity and a calm confidence. There was no doubt that she had done her homework on the Harrington Group. She was not starstruck. She seemed genuinely passionate about the role. An hour passed without him noticing. At the end of it, Richard leaned back in his chair and said, "You're the first candidate who hasn't wilted under these questions." Olivia smiled, albeit modestly. "I enjoy challenges, Mr. Harrington." Richard nodded. "Well, if you're willing to start as soon as possible, we could certainly use someone like you. My team will draft a contract, and we can discuss the terms if you're interested." They exchanged a firm handshake, and within 24 hours, Olivia Morgan became Richard Harrington's new executive assistant. That same evening, Serena tried to talk to Richard about attending a weekend therapy retreat. Yet again, he was buried in urgent documents, this time for a large real estate acquisition in Hong Kong. Though he was sympathetic, he insisted that he couldn't spare an entire weekend, promising instead to consider it after the deal was finalized. Frustrated, but determined not to push him away further, Serena relented. The next few days became a whirlwind for Richard and Olivia. She proved to be every bit as capable as she had presented herself. She reorganized his schedule, ensuring that he had room for both business and occasional personal appointments. She took detailed notes during board meetings, prepared concise summaries of investor calls, and even streamlined communication between different departments. Though new to the Harrington Group, Olivia quickly earned respect with her efficient management style. It wasn't long before Olivia caught glimpses of Richard's personal life, especially the conflict simmering beneath the surface of his marriage. She noticed phone calls from Serena that Richard missed because he was engrossed in negotiations. She observed how Richard's brow creased when his wife's name appeared on his phone screen, as though a pang of guilt accompanied the ring. Though she remained professional, Olivia could not help feeling a twinge of empathy. She recognized in Richard the familiar outlines of someone who had sacrificed balance for success. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling meeting with potential investors from Europe, Richard leaned back in his leather chair, rubbing his temples. Olivia stepped in with a glass of water and a gentle question. "Everything all right?" He sighed. "Just a tension headache, nothing serious." Though mindful of boundaries, Olivia couldn't help a kind gesture. "You should take a few minutes to decompress, Mr. Harrington. Maybe step outside for some fresh air." Richard studied her face. "I appreciate the concern. It's rare to find someone who notices things like that." Then he caught himself. "But I'm fine. Let's just finalize the presentation for tomorrow." A subtle current began to form between them, a mix of professional respect and personal awareness. Their days blurred into long hours of planning, strategizing, and traveling. Wherever Richard went, Olivia was there with neatly organized binders and a readiness to adapt to any crisis. Little by little, the barrier of formalities eased. They shared small talk during coffee breaks, joked about an arrogant investor who insisted on being called Your Excellency, and once even helped each other figure out the labyrinthine hallways of a client's corporate campus in Zurich. Back home, Serena grew ever more vigilant about the distance between herself and Richard. She also heard from one of the household staff that Richard's new assistant was extremely capable and quite lovely. While Serena didn't initially feel threatened after all, she knew a professional setup when she saw one. She couldn't ignore the twinge of jealousy that arose whenever she envisioned her husband traveling with an attractive, accomplished young woman. Trying to mend the distance, Serena invited Richard to join her at a fundraiser she was organizing for the opening of a new children's library in Queens. He promised he would attend, marking it carefully in his schedule. However, on the night of the event, an urgent business situation flared up on the West Coast and he had to fly to San Francisco. That he traveled with Olivia, though it was purely for work, was an unavoidable fact that stung Serena more than she admitted. Thus, two parallel lives continued, overshadowed by the spectre of ambition and the unseen consequences lurking on the horizon. In the midst of it all, Olivia Morgan quickly proved herself indispensable. She also became a quiet confidant, someone who held the keys to the kingdom that was Richard's complicated world. And in that role, she found herself walking a fine line between being a professional asset and becoming something far more personal. Weeks passed, and with each day the synergy between Richard and Olivia grew stronger. She possessed an uncanny ability to foresee his needs. If he was about to enter a high-stakes negotiation, she would discreetly place a folder with relevant research at his fingertips. Before investor luncheons, she would hand him a quick summary of each attendee's interests and backgrounds. In the countless flights between New York, London and Hong Kong, she managed to transform claustrophobic airplane cabins into makeshift offices where Richard could remain productive. Yet beneath her polished professionalism, Olivia was harboring a secret that could disrupt the delicate balance she had cultivated. Early one morning, as she prepared notes in her apartment for a forthcoming board meeting, her phone buzzed with a message. The name that popped up made her heart skip a beat. Serena Levine Harrington. Olivia stared at the screen, a wave of conflicting emotions washing over her. She had known Serena briefly in the past, during a philanthropic internship at a local art museum. It was a fleeting association that Olivia had nearly forgotten. Back then, Serena had been kind, guiding Olivia through the complexities of the charity's administrative tasks. They weren't bosom friends, more like supportive acquaintances, but they had shared enough personal conversations and mutual respect to count each other as more than mere strangers. During that summer, Serena had once invited Olivia to join a volunteer group trip upstate for an environmental cleanup project. They'd spent a weekend planting trees and removing debris from hiking trails. Around the campfire at night, they chatted openly about their aspirations. Serena mentioned her worries about how her fiancé's business might overshadow their personal life. Olivia confided her desire to find a career that would let her balance her organizational skills with her need to make a difference. They'd promised to stay in touch, but life had a way of pulling them in different directions. Now, years later, Olivia found herself working for Serena's husband, having neglected to connect the dots early on. At first, when David Albrecht had handed her the dossier on Harrington Group, she hadn't thought to connect Harrington with Serena's new last name. Part of her recognized Serena's married name as vaguely familiar, but the realization hadn't fully clicked until she saw a picture of the Harringtons in a business magazine. By then, Olivia had already accepted the job. She told herself it was simply a coincidence. After all, she needed the position, and it was a role she was more than qualified for. She had hesitated before contacting Serena. What would she say? "I'm working for your husband. We used to volunteer together." She worried it might put Serena in an awkward position or complicate her own role. Thus, she chose silence until that morning when her phone displayed Serena's name. The text read, "Hey Olivia, it's been ages. I was going through old volunteer rosters and found your contact info. I hope you're well and still doing amazing work. Let's catch up if you're ever free." Olivia set down her phone, her stomach churning. The right thing, she supposed, would be to inform Richard or to reply to Serena and explain the situation. But uncertainty gnawed at her. She feared that revealing their past connection might jeopardize her job, or worse, create tension between Serena and Richard. Perhaps it was best to keep the past in the past. Still, she couldn't banish the memory of Serena's kindness or the knowledge that the woman who had once supported her was now unknowingly married to her boss. Later that afternoon, Richard summoned Olivia to accompany him to a brief lunch meeting with a group of real estate magnates. As they walked through the bustling streets of Midtown, weaving between crowds and passing yellow taxis, Olivia tried to push aside her concerns, but the burden of her concealed link to Serena weighed heavily. The lunch meeting was at the private lounge of a luxury hotel. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, reflecting on marble floors. Waiters in crisp white shirts glided between the tables, pouring expensive wine. The real estate magnates congratulated Richard on his acquisitions and pressed him about potential future deals. True to form, Olivia took impeccable notes, capturing every detail with precision. Amid the business chatter, Richard glanced at Olivia. He studied her face, her calm exterior, the hint of preoccupation in her eyes. When the meeting concluded and they left the lounge, he asked, "Everything okay? You seem quieter than usual." Olivia hesitated. Part of her wanted to admit the truth, to share the guilt gnawing at her conscience. Instead, she managed a smile and said, "I'm fine, Mr. Harrington, just thinking about how to best summarize today's points." Richard nodded. "All right, but remember, if you need to talk." He paused, as if catching himself. "Never mind, let's head back." She knew he was about to extend a bit of personal concern, but their relationship was still defined by professional boundaries. As they strolled back, the New York sun reflected off the skyscrapers, and the city's noise seemed to amplify the tension inside her. Later that evening, Olivia finally drafted a courteous reply to Serena. "Hi Serena, so good to hear from you. Life has been busy, and I recently started a challenging new position. Hope you're well, would love to catch up sometime." She avoided mentioning that her new position was with Richard Harrington. Let the truth come out more naturally when the time was right, she reasoned. But the consequences of her silence were already unfolding. With each passing day, she grew closer to Richard, stepping into confidences that blurred the lines of professionalism. Meanwhile, Serena, unaware of this hidden link, continued to wonder who this Olivia Morgan was, the proficient woman who accompanied her husband to every meeting, who had apparently come out of nowhere but seemed indispensable to his life. The stage was set for a collision of secrets, and neither Olivia nor the Harringtons could guess how catastrophic that collision would be. 3 months into Olivia's tenure, the rhythm of her work with Richard found a near-flawless cadence. They communicated through a series of concise, coded signals. A slight nod to indicate moving on to a new topic during conference calls. A pointed glance at her watch to remind him of approaching deadlines. A raised eyebrow to hint at withholding certain information until a critical moment. This subtle interplay made them remarkably efficient. Outside observers occasionally mistook their synergy for something deeper. Rumors swirled around the corporate corridors. Some employees whispered that Olivia was nothing more than an opportunist, angling for a billionaire's attention. Others praised her as a consummate professional who saved the company from daily chaos. Richard, for his part, dismissed the gossip. He believed that as long as they performed well, idle chatter didn't matter. Yet in the quiet spaces, those moments in between scheduled calls and flights, an undercurrent had begun to flow between them. Whether it was the shared exhaustion of long workdays or the mutual admiration for each other's skills, a subtle intimacy developed. If Richard felt frustrated by a failed deal, Olivia offered a reassuring word or a half-joking remark that could diffuse his tension. If Olivia encountered a challenge like a departmental head who refused to follow protocol, Richard would intervene, offering support that went beyond a typical boss-employee relationship. This shift became palpable one night in London. They were there to finalize an international partnership. The negotiations had stretched from breakfast to midnight. At last, the deal was sealed, leaving them drained yet triumphant. Richard suggested a late dinner at an upscale restaurant near their hotel. Olivia hesitated but agreed, reasoning that it was too late for a separate meal anyway. The restaurant glowed with soft, ambient lighting. Small candles flickered on each table, and the hum of low conversation filled the space. Over glasses of aged scotch, they talked about more than work for the first time in months. Richard revealed bits of his past, his parents' struggles, his early dreams. Olivia shared snippets of her childhood in the Midwest, how she'd always yearned for a career that combined creativity and structure. For a moment, they laughed about silly childhood memories, Richard's attempt to fix a broken bike when he was 10, Olivia's disastrous first piano recital. The conversation felt easy, natural, even pleasant. Somewhere in the back of her mind, Olivia remembered that Serena had once confided similar stories to her, about the struggles of finding balance, about how her fiancé, now husband, was such a driven soul. A pang of guilt rattled her, but she pushed it aside, justifying that this dinner was merely a celebration of professional success. Yet as they left the restaurant, walking the quiet streets of London, a lingering tension enveloped them. It was in the way their footsteps fell in synchrony, the way Richard angled his body slightly toward hers, as if to protect her from the cold breeze. Their gazes intersected under a street lamp, and in that brief moment they both sensed a line trembling between them. A line neither had intended to cross, but one they were inching toward regardless. Upon returning to the States, Serena noticed a difference in Richard. He seemed buoyed by a new sense of motivation, as though a spark had been lit inside him. Paradoxically, he also seemed more distant. She caught him smiling at his phone once or twice, though when she asked what he found amusing, he would shrug it off, claiming it was just a funny meme a colleague had sent. She was too sharp to buy that explanation entirely, but she didn't press. Instead, she decided to rekindle their connection by planning a special anniversary trip to their favorite vineyard in Napa Valley. When she proposed the idea over breakfast, Richard gave a genuine smile. "That sounds wonderful. Let's make it happen," he said. In her excitement, she dashed off to begin the arrangements, failing to notice the half-second of hesitation in his eyes. Meanwhile, Olivia found it increasingly challenging to sleep at night. She would stare at her ceiling, recalling the times she and Serena had shared laughs at the art museum, how they'd parted ways with a promise to stay in touch. Now, not only was she employed by Serena's husband, but an emotional entanglement was slowly forming, a connection Olivia could not deny, yet desperately tried to rationalize away. She told herself this was all a misunderstanding of normal camaraderie. Besides, Richard was too devoted to his wife. Too honorable, wasn't he? At the Harrington penthouse, Serena prepared for their anniversary. She envisioned them strolling hand in hand through the vineyard, sampling wines, reminiscing about their early days. She hoped it would remind Richard of their shared dreams, of the life they had once imagined building together. If she could just pull him away from the incessant demands of the company, away from the mesmerizing efficiency of Olivia Morgan, then perhaps they could rediscover what made them fall in love in the first place. But fate, fueled by secrecy and unspoken yearnings, was steering them all onto a path none of them had anticipated. The line between professional and personal was blurring, and in that haze, hearts were poised to be broken. The planned anniversary trip was meant to be a turning point for Richard and Serena, a chance to renew their vows in spirit, if not in formal ceremony. With tickets booked and accommodations arranged, Serena waited anxiously for Richard to confirm his schedule. Yet, a week before they were set to depart, a crisis erupted in the Harrington Group's London office, an unforeseen lawsuit from a competitor alleging patent infringements in one of Harrington's newly acquired tech subsidiaries. Richard, already stressed by ongoing deals, saw no choice but to fly to London to address the issue personally. Serena pleaded with him to reconsider, or at least postpone. "We could leave a day or two later," she suggested. Just give me a sign that this marriage still matters." Richard looked torn. "It does matter, Serena," he insisted, "but if we lose this lawsuit, the financial fallout could be catastrophic. Investors will panic. This trip isn't just about me and my career anymore. Thousands of employees and shareholders depend on us." She swallowed her anger, knowing that in many ways he was right. "All right," she said softly, tears hovering at the edges of her voice. "Let's reschedule. But please promise me we'll go eventually." "I promise," he said, planting a hurried kiss on her forehead. And so he left, accompanied, of course, by Olivia. The trip to London stretched from days into nearly 2 weeks as they navigated legal battles, meeting after meeting with corporate lawyers. It was grueling work. Tempers flared, exhaustion gripped everyone. But at the height of chaos, something in the dynamic between Richard and Olivia shifted in an irreversible way. One night, after a particularly brutal negotiation session, Richard discovered that their legal team had made a crucial error, costing them leverage in the settlement process. He was livid, pacing in the suite of a 5-star hotel, barking into his phone at various attorneys. Olivia, though exhausted, attempted to calm him, offering careful reassurances. At last he sank into an armchair, dropping his phone onto the coffee table with a clatter. "I feel like the walls are closing in," he muttered. He looked at Olivia, who stood by the window, her shoulders sagging with fatigue. Yet she wore a patient expression, her eyes reflecting compassion rather than judgment. His defenses were down. In a moment that would later haunt him, he rose from the armchair, took a few steps toward her, and rested his hands lightly on her arms. "Thank you for everything," he said, voice hoarse. "I couldn't do this without you." The gentle touch, the proximity, and the sense of shared struggle unleashed a wave of unchecked emotion. Before either could fully register what was happening, Richard leaned in and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was tentative at first, a question more than a statement. Olivia froze, her mind screaming that this was a boundary they shouldn't cross. But the weeks of close collaboration, the emotional vacuum in her own life, and the unspoken tension between them eroded her resolve. She kissed him back. Time seemed to slow. When they finally pulled apart, a rush of guilt and realization flooded both of them. Olivia stepped backward, her breathing shallow, her hands shaking. "Richard," she whispered, "this is wrong. You're married. And Serena, she's—" He closed his eyes, exhaling a trembling breath. "I know," he said, sounding pained. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have, but you—" His words faltered. They stared at each other, each grasping the enormity of what had just transpired. For a fleeting moment, it felt as though the entire world was suspended. Then duty called. Richard's phone buzzed, snapping them back to reality. He answered it, forcing his voice to remain steady. Olivia, cheeks flushed, fled to her own room, where she buried her face in her hands. Memories of Serena's kindness at the museum rose unbidden, mingling with the fresh guilt of betrayal. "What have I done?" she asked herself. That night, neither of them slept well. The following morning, they avoided eye contact, devoting themselves to the settlement negotiations with meticulous fervor. Yet, as the days wore on, the emotional floodgates had been opened. A single moment of vulnerability had forged an illicit bond between them, one that was difficult to deny. They were acutely aware that any further transgression would be a deliberate choice, not an accident. But desire, once awakened, is a formidable force. Back in New York, Serena felt the distance like a physical barrier. Richard's messages became shorter, more clipped. The time difference gave him excuses to avoid prolonged conversations. Her heart began to pound with suspicion, a quiet fear that maybe there was someone else occupying the space in his life that should have belonged to her. Little did she know that not only was her suspicion tragically accurate, but it involved a woman she had once called a friend. Over the next few weeks, Richard and Olivia's interactions took on a new layer of complexity. They tried to maintain professional appearances during meetings and phone calls, but when night fell and they found themselves alone in hotel lounges or corner offices, their conversations turned painfully candid. Neither seemed capable of fully resisting the gravitational pull that had been set in motion. Richard battled overwhelming guilt. He rationalized that the distance in his marriage had created a vacuum, but deep down, he knew he was making choices that directly undermined the vows he had once cherished. Olivia, racked by self-reproach, considered quitting almost daily. She would draft resignation letters in her head, imagining a fresh start somewhere far from the Harrington group. Yet each time she tried to pull away, Richard would confide in her some new worry or frustration, reigniting her concern and sense of responsibility toward him. Serena, sensing something amiss, began to do her own quiet detective work. It started with a simple check of Richard's phone records, nothing too invasive, just enough to confirm that he was speaking or texting with Olivia Morgan far more frequently than any other colleague. She then looked at social media posts that documented Richard's business trips, noticing how Olivia was always present. Though Serena had traveled with him in the past, this was different. Olivia was stepping into a role that mixed business and personal realms with ease. Finally, Serena could bear it no longer. One evening, after returning from a charity committee meeting, she confronted him in their expansive living room. The penthouse was quiet except for the hum of the city below. Richard was reviewing legal documents on a tablet, but he looked up when he heard the tremor in her voice. "Is there something you want to tell me?" Serena asked, standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, arms crossed over her chest in a posture that both shielded and braced her. Richard set the tablet down, a flicker of anxiety playing across his features. "What do you mean?" She inhaled deeply. "Is there someone else?" Silence. The question seemed to echo through the apartment. Richard's initial instinct was to deny, but he found himself unable to utter a clear lie. His eyes darted away, confirming more than words ever could. Serena's voice wavered. "I knew it," she said, tears forming along her lashes. "Who is she?" He rose to his feet, feeling cornered. "Serena, it just happened. We never planned." "That's not what I asked," she snapped, the tears now giving way to anger. "I asked who she is." Richard swallowed hard, then said quietly, "Olivia." Serena froze in disbelief. Her mind flashed back to the days at the art museum, to the friendly, earnest volunteer named Olivia Morgan, the one she'd joked with about their futures. That her husband's mistress could be someone she knew, even if their friendship had been brief, shattered her sense of reality. She stared at Richard, eyes wide with betrayal. "Olivia Morgan," she whispered. "You're telling me you're cheating on me with Olivia Morgan, my friend?" He raked a hand through his hair, his voice shaking. "Serena, I didn't realize you two even knew each other until—" "But she did," Serena snapped. The pieces clicked into place. She must have known. Richard's silence was incriminating enough. Serena felt as if the ground beneath her feet had dissolved, sending her world spiraling into freefall. Her chest constricted, making it hard to breathe. "How long has this been going on?" His lips parted, but no sound emerged. In that moment, he looked more vulnerable than she'd ever seen him, like a man stripped of his defenses and forced to confront the ruin he had created. "It started in London," he finally muttered. The weight of betrayal pressed down on Serena's chest. She thought of all the nights she waited for him, hoping they could salvage their relationship. She recalled their wedding vows, the countless times she defended him to skeptical friends who wondered if his ambition would overshadow their love. Now, all of that seemed to crumble in the face of cold, bitter reality. Unable to bear another word, Serena turned on her heels and walked swiftly toward their bedroom. Before closing the door, she threw him a look filled with anguish and disdain. "I'll never forgive you for this, and I'll never forgive her." For a moment, Richard considered going after her, apologizing more fully, or offering some ill-conceived explanation. But he stayed rooted to the spot, sensing that words would only deepen the wound. In the silence that followed, he heard the muffled sobs from behind the closed bedroom door. Shame and regret formed a knot in his throat. He had always believed that a smart man could solve any problem, but this was a crisis of the heart, a realm where logic often fails. And so they remained on opposite sides of a door, each grappling with pain, rage, and a sense of profound loss. The confession had arrived, and with it came the first tremors of the tragedy destined to unfold. The days that followed the confrontation were nothing short of harrowing. Serena withdrew into herself, her pain transmuting into a seething anger that left her veering between tears and fury. She avoided Richard, choosing instead to sleep in the guest bedroom. His every attempt at communication, be it a softly spoken apology or a carefully worded text, was met with cold silence. Outside the penthouse, whispers of the affair began to spread. A few high-ranking executives at the Harrington Group noticed a shift in dynamics. Olivia's interactions with Richard became stilted, filled with awkward pauses. She was demoted in the unspoken hierarchy from a trusted ally to someone who carried the stench of scandal. Richard, though outwardly composed, wore a haunted expression in meetings, like a man tethered to a shameful secret. David Albrecht, ever the observer, sensed the undercurrent but refrained from prying. Serena, for her part, sought solace in her philanthropic work. She poured more time into her foundation, channeling her heartbreak into charitable endeavors, as if helping others might numb her own suffering. But the betrayal weighed on her psyche, refusing to be suppressed. One afternoon, she summoned the courage to send Olivia a message. "We need to talk." Olivia was torn between the dread of facing Serena's wrath and the guilt that gnawed at her every waking moment. Ultimately, she agreed to meet. They chose a small cafe in the West Village, far from the usual uptown circles. It was drizzling when Serena arrived, and she took a seat by the window, tapping her foot nervously against the floor. Olivia walked in a few moments later, hair damp from the rain, eyes filled with remorse. Neither spoke at first. The tension crackled in the air like electricity. At last, Serena broke the silence. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why would you do this to me?" Olivia swallowed. "I never meant to hurt you. Honestly, I didn't realize you were married to Richard until after I took the job. By then it was—" Serena cut her off with a raised hand. "That's not an excuse. When you found out, you could have told me. You could have quit." Her eyes brimmed with tears, but anger kept them from falling. "Instead, you ended up in his bed." "I'm sorry," Olivia whispered, her voice barely audible above the clatter of dishes in the cafe. "I'm not going to make excuses. It was wrong, and I take responsibility." Serena leaned back, her gaze piercing. "Do you love him?" The question hung in the air, heavy and charged. Olivia hesitated, knowing that any answer would feel like a dagger. I don't know," she finally said. "I care about him, but I never wanted this to happen." A bitter laugh escaped Serena's lips. "Well, it happened, and now you've destroyed my marriage, or at least what was left of it." She stood abruptly, unable to endure another second of that conversation. "Stay away from me. And stay away from my husband. Resign, move away, I don't care. Just don't cross my path again." Before Olivia could respond, Serena turned on her heel and left, the bell over the cafe door jingling ominously. Olivia remained seated, tears slipping down her cheeks. She felt every bit the home wrecker society would label her, and the weight of that guilt pressed down like a suffocating blanket. Meanwhile, Richard wrestled with the fallout at the office. Performance metrics were still strong, but tension among the staff threatened to fray the once impeccable corporate culture. He was keenly aware that an explosive scandal would be disastrous for investor confidence. The stress mounted until one day he called Olivia into his office. He expected her to arrive looking composed, but instead she appeared shattered, as though she'd been crying. "I think I should resign," she said quietly, before he could speak. Richard's chest tightened. He had come to rely on her abilities, her insights, even her company. Yet he also knew this was the logical step. "I understand," he said, though his eyes betrayed his regret. "It's probably best for everyone." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak further. After a moment he added, "I'm sorry for all of this. You deserved better." A mirthless smile flickered across her lips. So did Serena. With that, Olivia Morgan packed up her desk and slipped out of Harrington Group's headquarters for the last time. That evening, she left a note in Richard's mailbox stating that she was returning to her family in the Midwest for a while to figure out her life. "I'm sorry," the note ended. "I wish things had been different." In the penthouse, a cold war raged on. Serena maintained her distance, refusing Richard's attempts to reconcile. In private, he contemplated whether a divorce was inevitable. Part of him wondered if he and Olivia had any real future together, a notion that felt both thrilling and terrifying. Another part recoiled at the idea of breaking the marriage vows he once held sacred. As the days slid by, a storm of emotional and financial stress converged into a perfect tempest. A major investor pulled out of a new project, citing concerns about the company's stability. The press began sniffing around the edges, looking for juicy scandals. Shareholders demanded explanations, and in the heart of it all, Richard stood like a man, grappling with the wreckage of his own making. Serena barely recognized him anymore. He was gaunt, eyes sunken, spirit battered. But she found little pity in her heart. She was too consumed by her own heartbreak, too focused on the gaping wound left by betrayal. Neither realized how much darker things could still become, how tragedy, once sparked, often refused to be contained. As the scandal brewed behind closed doors, the Harrington marriage reached a tipping point. Serena could no longer stay in the penthouse. The memories of happier times taunted her at every turn. She could scarcely walk past the dining table without recalling candlelit dinners, or glance at their wedding portrait hanging in the corridor without feeling fresh stabs of pain. One afternoon she packed a few essentials and moved into a friend's guest house on the Upper East Side. She left a terse note for Richard. "We need space. Don't contact me unless it's necessary." Richard read the note with shaking hands. He felt numb. Everything he had worked for, his marriage, his pristine reputation, his sense of self, seemed irreparably damaged. That same evening, he found himself alone in the penthouse, his only company a half-empty bottle of whiskey. The city lights glittered mockingly below. He dialed Olivia's number, but it went straight to voicemail. He didn't leave a message. Instead, he composed a text. "I'm sorry, I'm lost. Please call me." He stared at the screen for a while, but no reply came. Finally, he turned off his phone. A hollow ache spread through his chest. The next day, Serena stopped by to gather more personal items. She arrived unannounced, thinking Richard would be at the office. Instead, she found him in the living room, wearing the same clothes as the night before, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep and too many drinks. On the coffee table lay a scattered array of documents, financial statements, property deeds, even a draft separation agreement. When he noticed her, he jolted, as if awakened from a dream. They stared at each other for a long moment. The tension was almost tangible, charged with resentment, regret, and unspoken sorrow. At last, Serena spoke. Her voice clipped. "I came to get the rest of my things." He nodded, rubbing his forehead. "Of course. Take whatever you need." She moved briskly, avoiding his eyes as she headed toward the bedroom. Yet, halfway down the hall, she froze. Memories swarmed her of laughter, whispered promises, and morning coffees in bed. Overwhelmed, she sank onto the edge of the bed, tears spilling unchecked. Richard heard her sobs and hesitantly walked over, standing in the doorway with a look of tortured helplessness. "Serena," he said softly, "I'm sorry." She looked up, her tears glistening. "Sorry doesn't fix this, Richard. Sorry doesn't erase what happened between you and Olivia. Sorry doesn't give me back the life I thought we had." He stepped closer, tears of his own forming. "I know. I wish," his voice cracked, "I wish I could go back and undo it." They locked eyes, and for a fleeting moment there was a spark of the love they once shared, a sorrowful, broken reflection of what might have been. As if by some unspoken agreement, they both realized this chapter of their lives was nearing an end. The only question was how devastating that end would be. In the midst of this private hell, fate delivered another cruel twist. Financial tensions at the Harrington Group had escalated. Leaks to the press suggested internal turmoil, fueling speculation that the company's leadership was compromised by personal scandal. Stocks dipped, prompting anxious board members to demand Richard's immediate attention. His personal meltdown collided with professional catastrophe, leaving him perilously close to a collapse. It happened on a stormy night, the city gripped by howling winds and lashing rain. Richard, reeling from a tumultuous board meeting where his judgment was called into question, got behind the wheel of his sleek black sports car. He scarcely noticed the storm raging outside. The turmoil in his own mind overshadowed even nature's fury. All he could think about was how he had lost Serena, how Olivia was gone, how his empire was threatened by his own failings. Just as he turned onto a poorly lit highway on the city outskirts, his phone buzzed. He glanced at it. Olivia had sent a single line. "Stop calling me, please. I can't do this anymore." A vortex of shame, longing, and despair consumed him. He looked up just in time to see a truck jackknife across the highway. He slammed the brakes, but the slick road offered no grip. The violent impact was immediate, metal screeching against metal. Shattered glass flew like deadly confetti. Airbags deployed, but the car crumpled beneath the truck's weight. In the aftermath of the twisted wreckage, paramedics arrived quickly, their flashing lights painting the stormy night in shades of red and blue. They found Richard unconscious, barely alive. The crumpled phone in the passenger seat still displayed Olivia's message, a final severance of hope. Serena was notified by David Albrecht, who arrived at the hospital disheveled and pale with shock. Time lost its meaning in those sterile corridors. As rain pounded the hospital windows, surgeons fought to repair the extensive injuries that ravaged Richard's body. Outside the operating room, Serena waited, racked by conflicting emotions: love, anger, fear, heartbreak, all swirling into a raw, unnameable ache. An eternity seemed to pass before a solemn-faced doctor emerged. His gaze dropped, and he whispered, "I'm sorry. We did everything we could." Serena felt the world lurch beneath her feet. In a single moment, all her anger, betrayal, and heartbreak were eclipsed by a grief so vast it threatened to consume her. She staggered, gasping for air, aware that despite everything, part of her had still held on to the faint hope that they might one day find forgiveness, might one day remember why they fell in love in the first place. But tragedy had no regard for second chances. Richard Harrington, visionary entrepreneur and flawed husband, was gone. His final moments spent in the throes of despair, a victim not just of a stormy road, but of the storm he had ignited in his own life. News of Richard Harrington's death reverberated throughout the business world. Financial analysts tried to predict the next moves for the Harrington Group, while tabloids latched onto the scandalous rumors surrounding his personal life. Headlines screamed of a fallen tycoon, of a marriage shattered by infidelity, of a swirling vortex of ambition and betrayal. The man who had once been a shining example of success now became a tragic cautionary tale. In the days following the funeral, Serena found herself in a haze of numbing grief. She donned a simple black dress, receiving a parade of condolences from people who had once idolized her marriage as the ultimate power couple union. Business rivals, former allies, philanthropic partners all arrived at the funeral to pay their respects, but also to feed their curiosity about the scandal. Serena stood by Richard's casket with composure, tears escaping her eyes only when she thought no one was looking. Despite her anger toward her late husband, she mourned him deeply. She grieved not only the man he was, but also the promise of the life they had once envisioned. During the funeral service, she remembered their wedding vows, spoken with hope and sincerity on a sunlit cliff in Capri. The memory tore at her heart. And yet, Even in her sorrow, she understood that the complexities of human relationships rarely fit into neat categories of right or wrong. In the ensuing weeks, Serena confronted the practical aftermath of his death. She inherited a substantial portion of Harrington Group shares, making her the largest individual shareholder. Lawyers and financial advisors urged her to sell, to distance herself from the chaos. But she hesitated. Deep within, she felt a responsibility to Richard's legacy, to the employees who relied on the company, to the philanthropic projects she and Richard had supported together. She decided to attend a critical shareholders' meeting. Dressed in a charcoal grey suit, she entered the boardroom where many had expected her to be absent, too consumed by grief. Instead, they found a woman imbued with a quiet determination. David Albrecht was there, his eyes betraying relief at her appearance. The meeting was tense, with various factions jockeying for power in the wake of Richard's death. Calmly, Serena presented her stance. She would retain her shares and would like to establish a new oversight committee focused on ethical governance, transparency, and philanthropy. Shockwaves rippled through the boardroom. Some scoffed, believing her ideas naive. Others, bruised by the scandal, saw in her proposals a chance to salvage Harrington Group's reputation. Though an uphill battle awaited, Serena's voice carried more weight than skeptics expected. Through measured conversation and careful compromise, she managed to push forward her agenda, securing a vote to create the Oversight Committee. Throughout this, she carried the ache of Richard's betrayal like an unhealed wound. Nevertheless, she channeled her anguish into building something worthwhile from his broken legacy. In a grim twist of fate, it was through tragedy that she found a renewed purpose. The philanthropic arm of Harrington Group received immediate support, and Serena took personal charge of these humanitarian projects, ensuring that the wealth Richard amassed would, in some part, be used for the greater good. Meanwhile, Olivia Morgan had quietly returned to her hometown in Wisconsin, grappling with her own remorse. She avoided news outlets, steered clear of social media, and struggled to sleep each night. The echo of that final text message to Richard, "I can't do this anymore," haunted her. She wondered if her words had triggered his state of mind, if her rejection had contributed to his fatal decision to drive that night. Though logically she knew she wasn't responsible for the collision, the guilt gnawed at her. She received a single letter from Serena, delivered by courier. Hands trembling, Olivia tore it open. It was brief. "Olivia, I want you to know that I do not blame you for the accident. You didn't force him to drink, to drive in a storm, or to look at his phone. That was his choice. We both know we made mistakes, he and I, and so did you. Life is complicated. I am writing to say I forgive you. Not because it erases what happened, but because I refuse to let resentment shape my future. Please take care of yourself, live well, do better. Serena Harrington." Olivia sobbed, pressing the letter to her chest. She read it multiple times, each reading a catharsis of sorrow and relief. Slowly, she began to consider a future no longer shackled by regret. She applied for a job at a regional non-profit, hoping to use her organizational talents to serve a good cause. Though she carried scars from her involvement with Richard, Serena's gesture of forgiveness kindled a spark of hope within her. Back in New York, Serena found herself carving a new identity from the ashes of her marriage. She moved into a smaller residence, trading the penthouse for a more modest duplex that overlooked a community park. She continued her philanthropy, joined local initiatives, and sought therapy to process her grief and anger. The memory of Richard still lingered, his ambition, his charm, his fatal flaws. She attended support groups where she discovered that tragedy came in many forms, and no one was immune to heartbreak. In time, Serena reconnected with the things that once brought her joy: art, music, the simple beauty of a sunset over the Hudson River. She discovered that broken hearts could mend, albeit with scars that remained tender to the touch. The ordeal had stripped away her illusions, but also ignited a deeper compassion within her. She vowed to remain authentic and open, to not let bitterness consume her. The Harrington Group also began a slow but steady climb toward moral and financial stability under the Watchful Oversight Committee. The scandal, once a near-fatal blow, became a pivot point, an impetus for positive change within the company culture. Though no one could forget Richard's downfall, they worked collectively to honor the best parts of his vision while learning from his mistakes. Ambition, when unchecked, can devour the very things we hold dear. Love, if taken for granted, can wither under the relentless pressure of ego and desire. Yet, in the wake of tragedy, life persists, offering the possibility of renewal for those brave enough to seek it. Serena Harrington emerged as a figure defined not by her husband's wealth or her heartbreak, but by her unwavering commitment to compassion and authenticity. She bore the weight of grief without allowing it to crush her spirit. She learned that forgiveness of oneself and of others is a potent force, capable of dismantling the chains of bitterness. Olivia Morgan, too, found redemption in the quiet spaces of Middle America. She rebuilt her life, bringing the hard-earned lessons of her past to serve a new calling. While she would forever carry the memories of betrayal and loss, she resolved to anchor her choices in empathy and integrity. As for Richard Harrington, his story concluded in tragedy. But perhaps the greatest tragedy would have been if those left behind failed to extract meaning from his mistakes. Instead, their paths converged in a collective pursuit of growth, of renewed connections, and of a more purposeful existence. In the end, love proved to be neither a fairy tale nor a mere transaction. It was a delicate dance requiring honesty, humility, and respect. And while not every story ends with two lovers reconciled or a perfect life restored, the pursuit of genuine human connection can still illuminate the darkest corridors of ambition and error.